Hey guys, my name is Aaron White with the A-List team, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about appraisers, specifically to sellers. We're going to cover the common questions that we get from sellers when we talk about appraisals and the conversations that we have along the way when it comes to the appraisal. So we're going to cover what is an appraisal, how is an appraisal different than a CMA or a comparable market analysis. These are things that realtors like us will commonly give you. And then also we'll dive into what can you do if a buyer is trying to back out of a transaction due to an appraisal. So these are the things to know and understand when you're going into the sale of your home. And let's dive in. All right, so why do we have appraisals? Appraisals are really out there to protect one or two things, really. It's to protect the buyer, their interests, and also to protect the bank that is making a loan on that property. At the end of the day, the bank who's making a loan on the property to purchase that property wants to know that their investment is going into something that has equity. So if the buyer, for some reason, has some sort of financial trouble, that they're able to recoup most, if not all of their money through a foreclosure and the sale of that property. Typically, the appraisal process will not start until after the inspection period is done. So once the inspection period is done, you've come to an agreement with the buyer that you will move forward in this transaction. The lender will order the appraisal, and then typically the appraiser will come out within 1 to 2 weeks from the time of that order and do their appraisal. Of course, that appraisal report is to figure out the exact value of that home in today's market. And they're going to do a very deep dive on that. So as realtors, we've already sent you some sort of preliminary report. We've shown you the pros and cons of your neighborhood and how to price your home. And ultimately, the appraiser's job is to go out there and verify that. So unlike a realtor where they're covering things like the legal documents that are promulgated by Texas and the process of funding and transacting and the lender and coordinating all the communication and visits and showings and all that stuff, the appraisal only has one job, which is to make sure that they understand the value drivers of that home and that neighborhood, the features of that home, and how they impact the price of that home. So they're going to go out and go through a very, very rigorous process of evaluation. We have a video and an article that go into much more depth on that, which we'll put in the link of this video here below. And feel free to dive in there. It gets into a whole bunch of things as to how they're different. But at the end of the day, an appraiser actually has a licensed process by which they're permitted to bring a value. They can look at things like comparable properties around in the area. They can look at things like what is the cost to build certain features or certain buildings and maybe appraise it based off the cost of the approach for newer construction. And last, the appraiser can look at just features and functions of the home or that neighborhood that might bring unique value to it and assign a cost measure to that. So for example, a pool might add X amount of dollars, and it may not always be the amount of money that you put in to that property. So for example, pools, very frequently now you'll see where a pool might cost $100,000 to $120,000 to build in a backyard, but it might only add $30,000 to $50,000 in value in that neighborhood. You really need to look at the data and see what the market has paid for those features, not necessarily what the original owner paid for those features. Okay, so let's say that you have now an offer that came in at your asking price. However, the appraiser came out and he said that it's actually worth a little bit less than what you have it under contract for. What happens? At the end of the day, the bank is going to tell the buyer and say, hey, we're only going to give you X amount of dollars. So we're going to reduce our amount that we're going to lend on this property. And they're going to give the choice to the buyer. Buyer, do you want to bring the rest of that money in cash to purchase this home? Or they might come back to the seller and say, hey, we'd like to renegotiate the price and ultimately settle at a lower value. If neither of those work out, then the buyer does have the option to walk away. So let's talk about that. How long does the buyer have to ultimately back out of this deal? And for what reasons can they back out of this deal? When it comes to buyers backing out due to financing, that's where we're going to refer to the third-party financing addendum that comes in that contract. In the third-party financing addendum, there are two reasons that a buyer can back out for, and that is the buyer needs to maintain approval for the loan, and then the property needs to get approval for the loan. And the buyer has typically, in Texas, between 20 to 25 days is typically what's going to show up on the contract. 21 seems to be a number that pops up a lot of times on that addendum. And that says basically that the buyer that's making this offer has 21 days to get approval from the bank. The bank's going to review their financial statements, their bank statements, their previous spending, so on and so forth, and validate that yes, this person does make the money, they do have the credit history to make these payments, and there's no issues with them as a buyer to be qualified to move forward. The next piece is the property, and the property is really boiled down to the appraisal and what the appraisal finds. So there are several things that may deny lending on a property. It could be physical characteristics that are found in appraisal. For example, you'll find regularly that if an appraiser reports that there was a leak in a roof or a structural issue, or sometimes even extremely simple things like a hole in the wall that might just be a $50 patch to cover, a lender may deny the loan based on the physical conditions in that property. Other reasons they could deny could be, example, insurability of the property. So for example, if the roof is a little bit older and they know in that area that most insurance companies are going to require a new roof, they may not allow the buyer to proceed and move forward. But last of all is really just the value of the home. If the value of the home comes lower in the appraisal than the contract value, then they may not approve that buyer to move forward. In that case, it begins one of those three like we talked about before. The buyer can bring the cash, or they can ultimately renegotiate with you, or they have the option to back out. And they have all the way until 3 days before the end of closing to have that conversation. This can cause, of course, quite a bit of strain on a family who's selling, especially if you've already moved all your stuff out to get to the end and not have this. And of course, we're always talking with the buyer's agents and trying to figure out when is that appraiser coming out and get that understood quickly so that we have a clear, are we going forward or not, well before you're moved out of the home. But nonetheless, this is later in the transaction and of course can cause quite a bit of an upset if we're not priced correctly according to the appraiser. So when we talk about pricing your home, pricing home is extremely important, right? Because yes, it's good to get top dollar. And many times we've actually set new highs in pricing a home here at the ALS team. However, if you get to the end and the appraiser doesn't give that stamp in the end, it can also cause quite a bit of frustration. And understanding that is important. So when you price it, you want to be strategic to get the offer fast enough and not have the house sitting on the market for a long time. But you also want to be mindful of the fact that coming the appraisal time, if you're in that top tier of the pricing, you do have a little bit of a risk of the appraiser agreeing. So you need to have already be thinking ahead of time, what are we going to do if that scenario occurs? Now keep in mind, the appraiser may agree to the value being higher than all of the comparable sales around you. I'll give you an example. We sold the house recently. It was a 2-year-old house in a small little neighborhood with about 30 homes. The greater neighborhood zoned to the same school systems and so on and so forth all had older homes in there. We're talking about 15 to 20 years older on average in that area, right? So these newer homes, there was no recent sales because all of them bought them just 2 years ago and no one had really sold in that area at all. And so all we had to go off of comparables was these older homes, which just didn't have the same feel. They had lower ceilings, completely different structure. You really can't compare one to the other, right? And so we wrote a letter to the appraiser pointing out several factors. A, this property was in a more desirable location, closer to grocery stores, closer to restaurants, closer to roads to be able to commute quickly to work, so on and so forth. And then B, it was a very different physical structure. So we took a look at sale prices 2 years previously. We took a look at general trends in the neighborhood showing growth in that neighborhood, even though it was a slower market. And then we applied those growth models to the sales prices of a previous time. And yes, our client sold at a highest price, setting a new high. And yes, the appraiser did approve the value of that contract. So it's not that it can't be done, but you do have to make a case as to why your home is being sold at a certain value. And so when we are trying to aim for top price at the A-list, we just say, let's be proactive. We're gonna have to coordinate the time for that appraiser to come into your home anyways to show them. And if a buyer's appraiser is gonna come, we're gonna write them an email or a letter explaining why we priced the home the way we did and having that position for them and ready to go. Hopefully they'll take that into consideration as they go through the process of appraising the home and bring those points to their attention. Okay, so hopefully the proactive approach of saying, hey, this is why we priced the home the way we did worked well and the appraiser approved it and we're moving forward, smooth sailing from here. However, sometimes That's not the case. Sometimes the appraiser does come back and say, nope, that's not the value of the home. The value of the home is lower. Can you push back? This is a question I get quite regularly from sellers who've had that happen is, can I push back? And yes, you can. Keep in mind that the appraiser is representing the lender of the buyer. So we gotta be pretty friendly and kind to the buyer's agent and the buyer. And of course, the buyer has to have the desire to go out and challenge this. So we're gonna need to first request the buyer send that appraisal report and give us some time to look it over. We're gonna be looking for things such as mistakes. The number one thing, easy fix to do is a mistake. For example, if they have in there reported that the square footage of your home is 2,900 square feet, but in fact it's 3,100 or 3,200 square feet, then the price they may have could be way off. And we could take that price per square foot they gave us and have them reconsider the value, total value, with the new added square footage. Other things might be features that they either did count or did not count towards it. And we could point out like, hey, such and such feature was omitted from the report. Maybe they didn't have a key pergola or something in the back that was added that they didn't add value to. And those might be things that an appraiser might just say, oh, yep, my bad. Let me make the adjustment and move forward. But in the event that it's not a mistake, we need to request a reconsideration of value. And I say we request this, it's really the buyer that needs to request this. They need to go to the lender and say, look, we think the property is worth more, we think the seller is right, and make that request. The buyer needs to be willing to do this because your home is really desirable to them and they want to live there. And of course, you're wanting your higher price, right? And we're not willing to bend at that point. So this is the scenario that we'd go through this conversation. But in that event, we can make a case as to why we think the value is higher. We'd have to document that, help the buyer ultimately present the reason to have that home reappraised. And then there may be some costs that the buyer holds to have that appraiser done a second time. So those might be things that all have to be negotiated and talked through. Who's going to cover those things? How are they going to get maybe a second appraiser out there and ultimately pin down the value of that home? At the A-List team, we love the thrill of setting new market highs in neighborhoods, and we're up for the challenge to tackle it. If timing or renegotiating or maybe falling out of contract is not an option for you, it would cost too much or impact your livelihood too much, keep in mind that pricing the home right is really important as we approach this process. Yes, we want to maximize the dollars in your pocket, but we need to have a real life look at properties near you, the features and pros and cons they have, the features and pros and cons that your house has, and price it according to market to get that appraiser's approval. So if you're wanting to get a new high, or if you're wanting to get a property sold and guaranteed to move it across, give us a holler. We'll walk you through that process. We'll see you at the closing table.